and they say, oh, another, I'm going to shoot up tonight, and I got my girlfriend, No, we can't have it. There's a limit. What, you're prohibiting? What if they want more potency? So the question is, you've got to build in prohibition some way, because some people are going to be restricted some of the time because they're at great risk, or because they're taking too much, or because they're getting into serious trouble, or because they're causing crime. There will be some degree. Now the question is, can we eliminate the causes of the prohibition requirement by getting rid of the criminal element? And the answer empirically is overwhelmingly no. It's an illusion. What you end up with when you try to end prohibition are prevalence rates and legal markets, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, with highly potent products moved dramatically that coexist with a violent, coercive black market that is still there, that is intensifying and is thriving. You get both. Criminal elements, evading taxation, smuggling to every state in the Union out of Colorado, smuggling in illegal workers from China to get into the grow-ops in Pueblo, Colorado, with people being shot daily for their rip-offs of criminal gangs that are international in scope, capitalizing on the Colorado gold mine of legal dope. I've worked in Colombia, I've worked in Peru, I've worked in Mexico. You cannot give a legal market and expect the withering away of the evil black guys who are coercive and violent. They thrive on that environment of more youth, more drugs, more readily available, more normatively acceptable, and less perception of risk. They will still be there and still at your throat.
So is this a consequence of partial legalization, that is legalization in some states and not others, and therefore the conditions that attend prohibition of market activity and all of the illegal behavior that goes with it existing around the states that are legal?
Good
so
point.
If this was a national policy or all 50 states legalized, do you believe these problems would disappear? So is the presence of all of these illegal markets and the violence that goes with them a consequence of partial legalization?
But no.
From your point of view.
And I see why one would think that. What if the next state, and then Oklahoma, and then what? But that's a regress, isn't it? Because there is an international world, isn't there? And they would come here. There's drug tourism in the Netherlands, and so forth, and Portugal now. So the point is, it's a regress. Well, the whole globe, then, damn it, it'd be Canada and Thailand, and even this guy in the Philippines, damn him. Well, hang on a second.
I don't think you're going to persuade him.
Okay, but let me give you the last thing that I think is most critical here. No, here's the problem. Learned this in Colombia, learned it in spades. There are people who already control this market. They didn't enter it as a mafia taking it over from Seagram's. They control the drug market. They're violent, they're willing to cut off heads, they will coerce families, and just because Monsanto sets up a drug marketing operation somewhere, they don't go, oh, geez, the corporations are here, the lawyers are after us, guess we're going out of business. They fight. They fight you, and they will slaughter you unless you take them down. They must be broken and eliminated from the system. After you establish security, it is possible to come in with alternatives and maybe have a regulated, controlled episode to try and help people in need of treatment and recovery, perhaps. But you can't do it while they're still there, still armed, and still corrupting the system, enormously powerful, and have the capacity and the willingness to take you down, which they do and almost got places like Mexico.
So Jeffrey, what do you make of that argument that that legalizing doesn't eliminate criminal markets and all that goes with it?
So I agree with the statement that the legalization proposals that have been offered in almost every instance retain some degree of prohibition, such as for teenagers. Okay? So with alcohol, it's outlawed for people under 21. Okay? Our experience with alcohol shows stunningly that we do not have Anheuser-Busch engaged in drive-by shootings against Corona and so on and so forth, that the market is not violent and corrupt, except a little bit, that there are presumably a few, 7-Elevens that sell to underage youth. There are some people who go buy for their friends who are under 21 and so on. So there's a little bit of the illegality, but nothing like the corruption or violence that we observe in completely prohibited markets. So that's just completely misleading, okay, the way Dr. Murray described it. Second, if you think that partial legalization, in cases where it has been much more partial, it hasn't gone nearly as far, has still allowed the black market to continue to some degree, and that's absolutely right in some instances, that's not an argument for more prohibition, that's an argument for even less prohibition. Okay, so for example, in Colorado, they have all sorts of relatively high taxes, they have all sorts of rules and regulations, there's zoning about where things, so of course there is still some marijuana growing by people in their basements or their attics, there's still some marijuana production sale going on in the shadows because there's still a lot of government prohibition and other regulation, which is raising the cost of transacting the legal market so people are staying in the underground market. The solution to that is get rid of more of that regulation, prohibition, and so on.
But keep the tax revenue?
Modest tax revenue, the same as other goods, maybe slightly higher than other goods. We have an alcohol tax that's higher than for general retail goods that doesn't by itself seem to generate a black market, although there have been examples where places have had cigarette taxes that were excessive, places that have had alcohol taxes that were so high that they recreated the black market. So yes, if you're going to try to be something other than just treat it like every other good, and you do it a lot, you're going to drive it back into the black market. But that isn't justifying prohibition. That's saying that when government interferes, it mucks things up. The solution is don't muck it up.
So let's talk about another way in which these consumption patterns muck things up. When people smoke cigarettes, they get cancer, and they're not the only ones paying the price of their getting cancer. The rest of us are paying for insurance costs and, early death and all of the consequences that follow from cancer. At least for some proportion of people who are driving drunk, there are costs being borne by the rest of us that if there was no control of any kind, presumably those costs for the rest of us would grow. So part of my question about people who have the libertarian model is how do we cope with these other externalities, other costs that are not being borne by the individual but are being borne by the rest of us? What is the solution to that? Because these are real costs, even if the damage to the individual user is something you might be willing to tolerate.
First response would be, one, you are saving some direct costs for prisons and police and prosecutors. You're generating some tax revenue, which is in part coming from the people who had previously been these traffickers and so on. But second, in most instances, the evidence shows pretty clearly that allowing the greater legal access to these drugs reduces healthcare costs. For example, there seems to have been substitution from opioids to medical marijuana in the states that have legalized medical marijuana, reducing opioid deaths, okay? Marijuana is relatively cheap, and a lot of people using it to treat their pain or their anxiety are going to spend less than they would, whether they're paying for it privately or it's reimbursed by a government health insurance, than they would on Xanax and Prozac and things like that. And many of them claim it's more effective than Xanax and Prozac and so on and so forth. So I don't think that that's actually a problem for the libertarian view, because factually, most of the effects are going to be beneficial on those external costs.
What do you think about that point?
The degree to which we've looked at this question before the drug issue came up, it was with regard to alcohol. And there's study after study. Alcohol is not my area in terms of a substance abuse analysis, but colleagues that I worked with have published this, including when we were in the White House and did an analysis of this. The social costs and the public health costs of alcohol consumption far, far, far exceed 7 or 8 to 1 the benefits of taxation and revenue from alcohol sales. It's considerably differential. I've read material where Professor Myron has alluded to the tax benefits potentially of drug taxation, which unfortunately does keep the black market there, so we either get it or we don't, and the costs to society. He deeply understates what our analysis showed of the cost to society for worker productivity, educational attainment, public health costs of an expanded or prevalent market for more drugs more readily available. It dwarfs the revenue that comes in from taxation and or sales dimensions or the economic stimulus of hiring more warehouse workers, because the Colombians have bought a new warehouse in Pueblo, Colorado, and are running more guns and more dope to the rest of the country, and it's a thriving business. it's dwarfed by the public health, productivity, and other damage, including educational. So it's not a good deal at this point. Maybe if we get everybody in the country to be smoking and paying the money, then we'd be better off with the taxation revenue. But I think there was a movie about that, wasn't there? Mr. Judge. I'm not sure it's good for society to do that. Before a liberalized administration, which is how I had to characterize the last 8 years of the Obama administration with regard to drugs at least, when we got legal marijuana in multiple states, and a turning off of efforts in the international arena. We no longer pursued coca in Colombia. We'd had major unprecedented successes, driving down 75% cocaine production out of Colombia and saved lives in the US thereby. So 8 years of that. We had 8 years ago around 1,700 overdose deaths a year of Americans from opioids. That from heroin particularly, that was constant. About 1,700 to 2,000 was the whole range for the whole decade. 8 years later, it's 52,404 all drugs, 33,000 opioids, 13,000 heroin alone, and that's for 2 years ago, 2015. It is absolutely reasonable to think that we were going to have 100,000 Americans die a year when we get the 2016, 2017 data that have already happened from opioids that are both illicit and licit. You have both. Both epidemics coincide. Pharmaceutical diversion that's regulated, and you can buy it, and the doctor pays, insurance does, so it's the clean type, and the very dirty fentanyl and heroin coming from the illicit markets. They just race each other. That's weapons of mass destruction level. 100,000 Americans a year, and no sign of slowing down. So whatever was the atmospheric change that made norms of drug acceptability more available, more widely used, made them accessible, it's not paid off well for the public health ledger. And the externalities are growing in the form of orphans. Those are costs.
Okay, let me ask another, I am a sociologist, so I'll ask a social control kind of question. I'm interested in what the two of you think about this, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for their questions. The main mechanism for enforcing forms of prohibition is jailing people, essentially. It's exacting punishment in the form of prison. And that has, as we know, a lot of other consequences in our society. And we have seen regardless of whether you think what people are being incarcerated for is using the drugs or dealing the drugs, I recognize it's probably a mix of the two, and actually I don't know very much about it. But I would even be happy to say it's dealing the drugs, whatever. Yeah. Mass incarceration has had its own very substantial consequences, and they're not evenly distributed. And that's largely because we've had a hollowing out of various and sundry industries and occupations, leaving especially low-skilled men with relatively few options in the labor market. And that has stimulated, or I guess created the conditions under which a very unequal movement into these illicit markets has taken place, and that means that the people who are being locked up are not a random sample of Americans. They're not a random sample of drug users, they're not even a random sample probably of drug dealers, but they are disproportionately minority men from inner city neighborhoods. And this has had a whole series of knock-on consequences that have been very damaging to those communities. And we are now paying a very long-term price for the dissolution of families, for the degradation of neighborhoods, all of which perhaps could have been avoided had there been a better legal job market for those men to partake of. If the main mechanism by which we achieve the control you're talking about is imprisonment, where do we draw the balance between the benefits that you see to society of controlling access to these substances through punishment and the damage done by mass incarceration? There are prices being paid and ledgers being written that are not directly about drugs, but they are about enforcement and how we achieve it.
Not only well said, well formulated, and agreed in many regards that this has become a crisis, and three things matter to me here. This crisis is not peculiar to the drug laws. The disproportionate minority affliction for arrest and imprisonment is true across the board for any crime. As a matter of fact, the drug differential is only 2.5 times greater.
That's a pretty big number,
It
don't you
is a
think?
big number, but it is dwarfed by what the assault number, the homicide number, oh no, they're 8 times greater.
We have
So what we
huge
have is
prison
huge crime
populations that have
problems.
come out of the drug laws.
All I'm saying is if there are, pardon?
We have a very big prison boom that it did emerge in part in response to drug enforcement.
Well,
You would-
I respect you very much as a sociologist.
Two and a
That
half
is not the
times is not a
case.
small number.
No, that's just the differential of those arrests who are minority to those who are non-minority. The lowest, well, but that could be a very long discussion. I would simply tell you that the notion that mass incarceration and prison construction were driven by incarceration from drug laws is a myth.
I'm not
there
arguing
is a-
that was the
okay.
only source, but to the
Okay.
extent
But
that
then
there's a
let me get back to
relationship, I'm
your wider
interested in
point.
your point of view
It would
about
be this.
enforcement.
There are better, enforcement is not necessarily the first resort by any means. It's very difficult to get thrown into prison. You have to have multiple repeat offenses, very serious nature. It's a forgiving system for the most part along the way, with some injustices clearly. Disenfranchisement, racism, structural issues, impoverishment, yeah, it happens. But for the most part, it's very difficult to finally get slam dunked in the supermax in Colorado. What happens is we usually try to defer people into drug courts, a growing and striking movement that has now several thousand such courts nationwide. And you get somebody who's got a drug problem and gets in front of the criminal justice system. You try and get them before you get into the criminal justice system, which you can do by interventions. If they're in front of the criminal justice system, you get a conviction, you then defer them away from jail time, from prison, from incarceration, into a treatment program that is sanctioned and supervised. They're remarkably effective if they are a sanctioned, supervised, court-ordered, working with therapeutic intervention. They can be valuable, and that is the first resort if the person is not a violent offender who is part of a dealing ring, who got here for reasons that have nothing to do with getting caught with a joint. Second thing that I would answer, and then I'll let it be, you think the impact of the drug laws on the inner city have been profound, and I agree they have been, and very, very devastating. So has crime. You have no idea what the impact of the drugs was. When we were in Capitol Hill, when we were working the political process, the people who spearheaded mandatory minimums were Leahy and Biden. The people who pushed us to get drugs out of the city were Elijah Cummings and the Black Caucus. The people who pled with us for support and help to get the dealers out of the buildings that they were burning down if they got turned in were those very political forces standing for the damage that was being done to their own people in their own cities and pleading for help. The drug laws had an impact differentially. The drugs had an impact differentially, and it was a cry for help.
Can I ask you what you think about these enforcement questions?
So it's absolutely right that there are a few legalizers who say things like the prisons are full of nonviolent drug people just convicted of drug possession, and that's a gross overstatement. The number of people there behind bars merely for drug possession is indeed quite small. Right? Nevertheless, there's a large number of people, something like 18 to 20% of the state prison population, which is much, much larger than the federal population, and I forget exactly, but 40, 50% of the federal prisoners for drug violations. So there are a lot of people being locked up for selling, for dealing. Okay? Second, that's only one part of the effect. To the extent that my view of what happens is accurate, that people are committing more homicides, more assaults, and more burglaries to pay for drug habits and so on, there are lots of people locked up because drugs are illegal, and that creates the violence and the property crime as a result, that you're not going to notice right away. They're not going to show up in this simple accounting, but they should also be attributed, at least in part, to the existence of drug prohibition. A different mechanism is, given we're trying to enforce this drug policy, we check people who are on parole or probation, we make them pee in a cup to see if they've used drugs, and we send a bunch of them back even if their initial crime had nothing to do with drugs whatsoever. So you could count that as an incarceration due to the drug laws. Then people who are under 3 strikes rules in various states, some of those strikes are from relatively small drug offenses, and they end up. So I suspect if you did that accounting, which is not easy to do, you'd certainly get well above the 20%. Whether it gets you to 30, to 50, I don't know. Okay? I think my view of the interaction between these race issues and the drugs and the incarceration is, first, there's a long history of states and countries prohibiting substances associated with immigrant groups, either internal or external immigrant groups, that they didn't want or didn't like in some reason. Anti-alcohol laws aimed against the Irish in the eastern states of the U.S. in the 1830s and 40s, anti-opium laws directed against Chinese immigrants in the 1880s and 90s, okay, anti-cocaine laws directed at internal migration at African Americans in the 1900s and 19-teens, anti-marijuana laws aimed at Mexicans. So there's a long history of that. But there also, I think, is this more general fear, racism, whatever you want to call it, that the majority has held for a long time, that Michelle Alexander, I think, explains, brilliantly, and basically says when the majority was no longer able to keep African Americans down via Jim Crow, they switched to keeping them down by locking them up using the drug laws. And she's, quite eloquent and quite suggestive on that. So to say it's just the drug laws would clearly be too strong, but the drug law was the mechanism that may have reflected a more fundamental sort of concern and current in American society.
So let me ask you then, to the extent that you would support any form of regulation, which I think from your perspective would be more behavioral and aimed at those who are in excessive use categories, what's the right mechanism of enforcement of whatever regulatory scheme you could imagine? Do you think that, you talked about using taxes to make things more expensive, but if you're really looking at the extreme cases, is this about writing tickets? Is this about, how would you structure a regulatory enterprise for those limited cases you believe actually?
So I think a first approximation is just to say the alcohol model, and then to say which parts of the alcohol model are pretty clearly doing more good than harm. And I suspect that a 21-year-old drinking age is relative to, say, 18 or 16 even, is doing more harm than good because it's teaching people that laws are for suckers. It's not keeping more than a teeny number of college kids, 18 to 20-year-olds, away from alcohol, as I'm sure various people in the room will attest. So I think even if you start with that, you should then think about, are each of those pieces sort of useful? Do public education campaigns, this is your brain on drugs, does that actually discourage kids from using drugs? The most recent version of that ad had this very attractive, 20-something with a frying pan in a kitchen saying, that was the old ad, this is your brain on drugs, new drugs are much worse, and she runs around the kitchen bashing plates and glasses. Okay. What, normal male is going to look at and say, oh, I'm never going to touch drugs. You're going to look at that ad and say, wow,